We are doing this series through the book of Revelation, which is the last book in the New Testament, the last book in the entire Bible. And we are in our 8th week of going through the book of Revelation. And this whole series is 11 weeks. We're actually going to finish up the book of Revelation on the 10th week, but we did an 11th week because we wanted to leave a week for your questions. Because as we've gone through this, I'm sure there's things that man, I wish we would have talked about this, or I have questions about this. So that's what we're going to do the 11th week. So we're going to start taking questions really as soon as you have them. And so there's an email address that we set up. It's just revelation@fcchb.com. And so if there's something that you're like, man, I have more questions about this, or I want to know about this, or we didn't talk about this at all, and I'd love for us to say something, just email those questions in. And we're going to go through those. We'll prepare some of those questions ahead of time. Some will actually take that day. We're working out exactly how we're going to do that. But we want your input and feedback to set up that last 11th week because we want to talk about what we may have missed or what we could further clarify. So any questions you have, email them to revelation@fcchb.com. Obviously, we won't be able to get to every single question, but we're going to do our best to answer the ones that come up the most. The third thing before we get into this, I just want to say this up front because I don't want to get angry emails this week. This week, there's an image from the book of Revelation that's kind of a common image. That image is the Whore of Babylon. That's the section of Revelation that we're in today. And I say that because if you have a child in here and you don't really want to explain to them what the word prostitute means or what adultery is, you may want to go check them into our children's ministry. There's nothing overtly sexual about the message itself, but that's the metaphor that's being used. So I just want to make you aware of that. So if you have to have an awkward conversation with your child, that's on you because I warned you. So don't give me an angry email. I gave my warning. So here we go. Like I said, we are in the 8th week of working through Revelation. And Revelation is a letter. It is first and foremost a letter. It is a letter written by this guy, John, to 7 churches that are located in what you and I know as Turkey and kind of in the ancient world, what was known as Asia Minor. So here's a map of all these churches. They're all kind of close to each other. They're not far. They're kind of on this big trade route. These are pretty big, important cities within the first century Roman Empire. Revelation is written toward the end of the first century, about 80 or 90, somewhere in there. And so at that point, Rome is in control of the entire Mediterranean world. They have a pretty powerful emperor. His name is Domitian. And at the time, the Roman Empire is approximately 50 to 60 million people. Our best estimates are there's only about 7,500 Christians in the entire empire. And so Christians represent this very small, marginalized, often persecuted minority. And these churches in particular are right in the heart of the Roman Empire. And so John is writing this as this letter of encouragement for these small, powerless minority churches. And he's telling them, hey, here's how you overcome. Here, the theme of Revelation is victory. Hey, in Jesus, we will have victory, even though these churches are up against incredible odds. They are in these big cities that are centers for Roman civil religion, which was worshiping the emperor, Roman power, Roman wealth, Roman politics, Roman violence and oppression. They face a lot of challenges and obstacles. And John is saying, hey, stay faithful. You will overcome. And what John presents is kind of this struggle. This battle. And there's essentially 2 sides. And here's the way John lays it out. If you want to put up that next one. On the one side, you have the slain lamb, which is Jesus. That's how Jesus is portrayed over and over again in Revelation. He is the slain lamb. He came down, he was beaten, he was crucified, he was killed, he resurrected, but this is who he is. He's the slain lamb, and his people, his followers, the church are his witnesses. Their life, their entire life is in witness to the slain lamb who has become king. And on the other side, you have this dragon, that this is how John represents Satan, or actually it's the Satan, the enemy, the adversary. And the adversary has these 2 beasts that are really kind of meant to resemble Rome and the power of Rome. Rome and Rome's leadership, Rome and the emperor, Rome and Roman ideology. And so these are these 2 sides that John presents. And so on this side, you have the slain lamb and you have witnesses. And Jesus has already overcome because he's already faced the worst of the Roman Empire and he resurrected. But now you have these witnesses, the church, that's living in the midst of this power. And John will say this is incredibly powerful. The power of Rome, the power of evil is overwhelming. And so this whole book of Revelation is about how do the witnesses live in a way that ultimately leads to victory over evil and victory over evil as it is embodied in the Roman Empire. And so far, everything we've seen in Revelation up to this point has really just been about continuing to persevere in the face of suffering. Hey, as the church, you're facing suffering, you're facing obstacles, keep persevering. You will overcome, you will win, you will triumph. But today, it's going to start to shift a little bit as we move to the end of Revelation. Today, we're actually going to start to see what does that look like. So far, John has just been promising, hey, you will overcome. You will overcome. In the same way Jesus overcame, you will overcome. But all the church has faced so far is suffering and death and persecution and disease and natural disasters and all the chaos that we face in human life. But now that script is going to start to flip, and you're going to start to see how. What does that look like? How exactly is the church going to overcome? And as we've been making our way through Revelation, we've been going like in order. But real quick, what I want us to do is I want us to go to the end real fast. I want to read a couple short verses, because understanding those verses is going to help us to understand what we're going to talk about today. And so this is kind of a picture of the end. When John gets to the end, like the culmination of the story of Revelation, the culmination of human history, here's what he says, Revelation 21, verse 2, and then we're going to skip to verse 9 and 10. It says, "Then I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband." Then if you skip down to verse 9, it says, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And he showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. And so like the big culminating image of Revelation, when you get to the end, like the resolution of the entire story is this marriage between God and between his bride. Now, the bride is often described as a new Jerusalem or a new holy city. John's not talking about a specific physical city. He's talking about the people of God. That's who it is. And so ultimately, Revelation culminates in this. It is a marriage between God and his people. And that's why actually, if you go back into Jesus has this whole section where he talks about how he's inviting people to a wedding feast. Invite these people to a wedding feast. That marriage is actually used as a metaphor throughout the entire New Testament, but even the Old Testament, even going into the story of God and Israel, it's this metaphor that's used to describe the connection and the relationship between God and his people. It's this marriage connection. That's the level of relationship. That's the level of intimacy. But it's also used to describe kind of the fidelity of the people to God. Because remember, that's the theme of Revelation. Stay faithful to God, stay faithful to God, stay faithful to God. And so ultimately, what does your faithfulness lead to? It leads to this beautiful marriage where everything is overcome. And so again, at the heart of this biblical story is God is always faithful to his people. Right? He's most faithful in Jesus, that God enters earth in the person of Jesus, and he suffers and he dies and he overcomes. So God has proven his faithfulness. And so John now throughout Revelation is telling people, hey, we need to remain faithful to God in the midst of our challenges, in the midst of our life. And if we do, then this is what awaits us, this beautiful marriage, this union between God and his people in this garden city. And so marriage fidelity is kind of like this backdrop, right? That's N.T. Wright, who's this great New Testament scholar. He refers to this as the final image of Revelation. It's concluding image. And here's why this is important. Here's why we're going to get here in a couple weeks. So we're going to come back here. This is the beautiful closing image. But it's important to understand this image because if we go back to chapter 17, which is where we're at today, here's what John says in 17, chapter 17, verse 1. "One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, 'Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by the many waters. With her, the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries.'" So again, what John uses as this beautiful image between God and his people is marriage fidelity. Right? That you have this bride and this groom, and they come together, and this is the picture of God and his people. And this is what faithfulness to God looks like. And so the opposite of marriage fidelity is adultery and prostitution. And so this is the metaphor that John is going to use. So he's going to get to the whole marriage thing when he talks about God and his people. But now as he's addressing the other side, as he's addressing the dragon and the two beasts, The metaphor he's going to use is prostitution and adultery, because that is the opposite. And so prostitution and adultery, this is life against God. These are people who are against God. Not necessarily that they look at it and go, hey, God is my enemy, but that everything they do, everything they're about, their whole way of life is opposed to God. And the whole reason God created everything. And everything God is trying to do to redeem creation. Now, I want to make this clear too, just so there's no misunderstanding. A lot of times when you talk about prostitution, when you talk about adultery, these are things that a lot of times happen because of brokenness or pain. Like a lot of people will end up in prostitution out of a sense of desperation. Some people are even sold into prostitution. And the same thing with adultery. A lot of times adultery happens out of a sense of brokenness. Right, a relationship falls apart, and so someone ends up committing adultery. Now, please understand, I'm not saying this justifies the action. I'm not saying these are excuses. I'm just saying a lot of times when you talk about these things, there's brokenness around them. I just want to be clear, that's not the image that John is painting at all when he talks about adultery and prostitution. John is talking about the polar opposite extreme. John is talking about prostitution and adultery in terms of like wealth and arrogance and indulgence. And here's people that have become so powerful and so wealthy. They're just sleeping with whoever they want to sleep with. And they're just going around and they're having these parties where they're getting high dollar prostitutes and they're coming in, and it's just overindulgence and wealth and power. It's like sex that sells. Right? It's sex that leads to power and to glory and to wealth. This is the picture that John is going to paint. This is what he's going to use. And the reason he's going to use these is he's really going to like draw a distinction between what's happening on the outside, but what is the reality on the inside. Because John's going to say, look, on the outside, you will have these people, you will have these nations, you will have these ways of life that are all about indulgence, and they're all about power, and they're all about wealth. And on the outside, everything looks great, and everyone's having fun. And, he talks about it there. They get drunk, intoxicated with the wine of adulteries. Everyone's loving it. But inside, what's really going on inside individuals, what's going on inside societies, what's going on inside nations is just, it's a mess. It's filthy. It's wretched. There's nothing but actual destruction and death. And so again, the image that John is going to use is prostitution and adultery because it's counter to the fidelity that exists between God and his people. So Revelation 17, verse 3, John's going to kind of unpack this and tell us really what he's talking about here in chapter 17. He says, "Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with the abominable things of the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery: Babylon, the great mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus." So John has already described these 2 beasts that represent Rome and Rome's power. And now John says, I see this other vision, and I see this woman, this great prostitute, who is riding this beast, who is on top of this beast. So this woman now is sitting on top of Rome that is this beast. And again, look at how she's described. She's described with opulence and jewels and all of this incredible wealth, but also this language of just debauchery. I mean, here she is. She's the mother of all prostitutes. She's drunk on the abominations that she's committed with all these different nations. And John refers to this woman as Babylon. Now, Babylon is the great enemy of the people of God from the past. If you go into the Old Testament story, Babylon is who finally conquers the people of God. At the time Babylon comes along, the nation of Israel had already been divided into 2 nations, and all that was left was this country that was called Judah, and in the middle of Judah was Jerusalem, the capital, the temple. Babylon is who marches in, they conquer Judah, they level Jerusalem, they burn the temple to the ground, leave it nothing but a pile of rubble and ash, and they exile all the Jewish people out to live all among Babylon. They are the ones who brought an end to the God's people, the nation of Israel, to the holy city and to the temple. And so this is, for the people of God, this is their great enemy. So when you bring up Babylon, it brings up all kinds of like this visceral emotional response because this is our arch enemy. Think about like in the context, I don't know if you're a sports fan or anything like that, but whenever you're a sports fan, you have a team. When you have an arch enemy, it's not just like, oh, I dislike that team. There's teams you dislike, like when our team plays another team, I dislike this team. But then there's other things that like, literally, I hate this team, I hate their fan base, I wish their entire city would just be nuked off the planet. Like this is about, okay, so I went through and I found some examples. So here's probably the clearest example, right? The Yankees and the Red Sox. These two, that like they hate one another. Their fan bases hate one another. They can't stand. This is arch rivals. Right? Going global, like this is baseball is more of kind of, but if you go global, Real Madrid and FC Barcelona, if you're a soccer fan, these are two big soccer teams, football teams that play in La Liga. They hate one another. They have some of their players have switched sides, but they can't stand one another. If you want to go a little more local, you got the Lakers and the Celtics. I mean, this is a bitter rivalry where they can't stand one another. If you want to go even more local, right? You got Fountain Valley and Edison. They play in the Bell game. Right? I mean, this is like kind of these bitter rivalries. Another local one that we got coming up soon. This one may be even more heated. UCLA and USC. Yeah. See? But these arch rivals don't just exist in sports too, right? You can go outside of sports, comics, Marvel and DC. I mean, these two kind of opposing things. Which one's better? When you get into the fashion world, especially the world of sneakers, do you like Nike or do you like Adidas? What's your choice? You get into beverages, soda pop in particular, Coke or Pepsi. I mean, where does your loyalty lie? And probably the most important one, NSYNC or Backstreet Boys. Like, which is your big thing? So this is like, you have to understand that when John starts bringing up Babylon, this is the kind of like visceral emotional response he's looking for. Because when Babylon comes up, it's like, this is the great enemy. This is our arch rival. These are these people who brought these, and so the response it would have to these seven churches, that's the kind of response it would have. Now, it's important for us to understand here that when John brings up Babylon it's not just a country, it's not just a nation, it is a whole way of life. And it's a way of life that is in opposition to God, which means that it is ultimately a system of oppression and destruction. Bruce Metzger, he's passed away a few years ago, but he's a great New Testament scholar, great Greek scholar. Here's what he said. He said that Babylon, he's talking about Babylon in the book of Revelation. Babylon is allegorical of the idolatry that any nation commits when it elevates material abundance, military prowess, technological sophistication, imperial grandeur, racial pride, and any other glorification of the creature over the creation. And so what Metzger does, he points out, is he's like, listen, there isn't just one Babylon the way that John uses it. John actually uses Babylon to talk about this whole way of life that is in direct opposition to the way God created the world. And there's even, when you get into Revelation, if you were to go back and read this yourself, there's this language where Babylon is being described, and Babylon will be described as it was, it is not, and it will be again. And the whole point of that is that Babylon keeps coming back up. It keeps coming back up. The Babylon, the Old Testament nation of Babylon, the nation that conquered Israel, they got conquered by the Assyrians. So they're long gone. But John's point is, they always come back. There's always a Babylon. Babylon is this way of life that keeps resurfacing in different ways through different powers, but it is always there. It is always present. It keeps popping up. Now, John will go on to specifically identify Babylon for these seven churches. Because in Revelation 17:9, he'll say this. He'll say, this calls for a mind with wisdom. The seven heads that he's describing are seven hills on which the woman sits. Everyone in the first century world knew the geography of Rome. Rome sat on seven hills. And everyone knew that. It was the city on seven hills. And so John clearly identifies, hey, for these seven churches, here's your Babylon. Your Babylon is Rome. And so what John does is he takes this, he's already talked about Rome as this beast, and now he takes Babylon, the great oppressor, as this prostitute, and he has the prostitute sit on the beast, and really what he's doing is he's putting them together. That's who this is. Rome is your Babylon. Later on, John will say that this prostitute, this woman, she is the city that rules over the entire world, which was Rome. And so really, too, from a practical standpoint, this is brilliant. Because again, remember, these churches are small and powerless. And if you're going around talking about how horrible Rome is and Rome's going to fall and Rome's evil, you're going to get in a lot of trouble for that. But if you talk about Babylon, Babylon's going to come to an end. Babylon's going to fall. People in the Roman Empire are like, Babylon fell a long time ago. Whatever, you people are crazy. So it is actually a brilliant, subversive way to talk about the destruction, the eventual destruction of Rome without actually mentioning Rome. But that's what John does. He ties these two things together. And he talks about the power, all of these heads and these kings and these crowns. And Babylon as a system, as a way of life embodied in Rome for these 7 churches, Babylon has one purpose. Verse 13 through 14. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. The one purpose of Babylon is to fight against the Lamb. And again, this doesn't mean that Babylon or Rome or anybody else looks at God or looks at Jesus and says, this is my enemy, I'm going to overcome them, they're evil. No, all it means is that their very way of life, the way that they live, their culture, their society, their dream for the future, their hope for the future is in opposition to what God is doing in the world. And that's why there's this battle. That's why there's this war. That's why there's this conflict that's brewing between what God is doing through Jesus and the way of Babylon that in the first century is embodied in Rome. That's where the conflict comes. They want two different things. But again, John says God is going to be victorious. The Lamb. The image of victory in Revelation is always the slain Lamb. Always. How does God win? Through the victory of Jesus, through his death on the cross. That's how God wins. And God will be triumphant. The Lamb will be triumphant, and so will those people that are faithful to him. So will those people that endure and work through all of these things with him. And now here's what's interesting. John has been promising, like these visions have been promising, God will be victorious, you will be victorious, you will be victorious. In Revelation 17, he's actually going to say, and here's how that victory is going to come. But listen to what he says. Right? He's described this image of this prostitute on this beast, and this is Rome, the embodiment of Babylon. They're against God, they're going to fall. Listen to how they fall. 7:16. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. So John has taken these two images. You have Babylon, who is this prostitute, and you have Rome, who is this beast, and he's put them together, and he said Rome is the current embodiment of Babylon. This whole way of life that is in opposition to what it is that God is doing, and they have kind of become one. But now what happens here? They turn on each other. The prostitute and the beast turn on each other and literally bring one another down. That it's not just that God walks in with this army and just kills all the emperors and Caesars and everybody. That Rome, the embodiment of Babylon, is literally torn down from within. And it's described here as like, hey, this is the will of God. I mentioned this earlier, but if you go back to Romans 1, Romans is the letter that the Apostle Paul writes in the New Testament. In Romans 1, Paul talks a lot about what we might call passive judgment. And Paul actually uses the word wrath. Paul says God's wrath is being revealed on the world. But what's interesting is when you look at what Paul's saying, Paul's not saying that God is like striking people down and killing people left and right. No, the actual words that Paul uses is Paul says that what God is doing is he's handing people over to their desires. He's letting them engage in their desires. He's letting them do what it is they want to do. And so engaging in these desires brings this certain amount of temporary pleasure, but long term, what it brings is destruction. And so Paul's whole point is, look, we're literally destroying ourselves. And it's the wrath of God in the sense that he's letting us do it. He's not actively doing anything. He has just given us the freedom and the ability to do whatever we want to do. And in the selfish pursuit of our own desires, we're killing ourselves, we're killing creation, that we literally carry within ourselves the seeds of our own destruction. And so Paul's point is, left to our own devices, we will destroy ourselves. Because we will just keep indulging in these desires over and over and over again. This is now what John is saying about Rome. That Rome literally has within her the seeds of her own destruction. You have a society that is built on indulgence and war and violence and power. And guess what's going to overcome them? War and violence and power and indulgence. That's where this is going to end up. They are literally going to destroy themselves. It's not that God is going to strike Rome down. God doesn't strike Rome down. You can read about the fall of Rome, and the Viscos and the sack of Rome and all that kind of stuff. It is internal, is ultimately what brings Rome down. And again, John's point is all of these systems, all of these ideologies, all of these ways of life that stand in opposition to God will eventually fall. And this leads John into this famous, it's a couple chapters long in Revelation, but it's this lament over the fall of Babylon. Here's what John says, Revelation 18, 2-3. He says, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She's become a dwelling for demons and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. And so again, this lament goes on for a couple chapters. And if you're the seven churches that are hearing this lament, this is music to your ears. Because this whole lament is this song that's basically saying, hey, Babylon, in the case of these seven churches, Rome is fallen. It's going to fall. Within it is the own seeds of its own destruction, and it's going to fall apart. That even now, again, remember outside, it's this picture of wealth and prosperity, and you have this woman, and she's covered in all these jewels in this cup, and she's intoxicated on everything she's doing. But John says it has become just this haunt for demons. And it is this empty, broken mess, and it is falling, and it is done, it is finished. And so it's like music to the ears of these seven churches. That yes, this whole system, this whole way of life that is in opposition to God, that is against us, that is the reason behind our suffering, it is the reason behind our opposition, it is going to fall apart. All of these systems of Babylon, as much as they keep coming up over and over again, whatever they look like, and every time they're going to fall, they're going to break apart, they're going to end. That's the good news of Revelation, right, to these seven churches. That this whole system of oppression around you is going to fall. Babylon will always fall. That's the message of Revelation. But then there is something these seven churches need to do. There is a challenge to these seven churches. And here's what it is in verse 4. Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. So the overwhelming encouragement to these seven churches is Babylon, aka Rome, is going to fall. But now here's the challenge to these seven churches. You live within Rome. That's where you exist. And so if you are not going to share in the ultimate fate of Rome, then you need to come out of Rome. He's not talking about physically moving. What he's talking about is more what we might call like ideologically. That you live, these seven churches operate and exist. The people who make up these churches operate and exist within the Roman system, within the Roman ideology, within the Roman framework. And again, the whole point of Revelation is if you share in the Roman system and ideology and framework, then you share in Rome's fate. That's the whole point of it, right? Because again, when the beast and the prostitute, when they're judged, notice it's not just the beast and the prostitute that are judged, but it's also all these other nations and people who were complicit in that. You were a part of it. You knew what was happening and you let it go. You took part in it. And so the challenge to the churches is, hey, in order to not share in what's coming, you need to get out. You need to ideologically remove yourself from the whole Roman system, the whole Babylonian system, the whole Babylonian way of life. And you need to live a life that is rooted in fidelity, faithfulness to Jesus and to who he is and to the way that he lived. Again, the message of Revelation is victory, but the challenge is to come out from Babylonian ideology. See, the thing you and I now have to remember is that Babylon keeps popping up over and over. John said that. It was, it's not, it will be again. Rome fell. Everything John said about Rome comes true. Rome falls, Rome is sacked. But Babylon persists. Every generation, Babylon pops up again. And it may look different and it may feel different, but it's always rooted in this way of life, this whole ideology, this whole system that is adamantly against God. And so living as God's faithful people is about fidelity to Jesus. It is. It is about faithfulness to Jesus, love, worship, all that stuff. But to some extent, it is also about discerning and identifying the presence of Babylon in our time and in our lives. To a certain extent, fidelity to Jesus looks like that. How do I remain loyal and faithful to Jesus? Is I have to, because you and I live among Babylon. Because like John said, Babylon always is, keeps popping up, keeps showing up. So you and I live our lives in Babylon. We're surrounded by Babylon. And so faithfulness to Jesus means we have to be able to discern the presence and the power of Babylon in our world and in our lives so that we can come out of it. So that we will not be shaped by Babylon, but we will be conformed to look more and more like Jesus. And really, when you get to Revelation, this is the heart of what Revelation is doing. If you go back to chapters 2 and 3, the opening of the book of Revelation, there's all these letters, specific letters that John writes to these churches. And in these letters, he says things like, remember the height from which you have fallen, and you've forsaken your first love, and you've become lukewarm. If you look at the whole context of Revelation, everything John says in 2 and 3 is about identifying within these 7 churches the way they have been shaped by Babylon. Look, this is what Babylon has shaped you to do. You have not been able to discern Babylon's presence among your church, and so you've lost your first love. You've fallen from this height. You've become lukewarm. The whole really challenge of Revelation is for churches, for Christians, to discern and identify the presence of Babylon amongst ourselves so that we can resist it. And I really feel like this has always been a thing, right? Churches, Christians have always tried to identify, like, how are we being shaped by culture? But I feel like that took on, like, a whole new life when COVID came along. Because COVID came along and you had all these mandates, you had all these restrictions, and it really people really started hammering, like, you're not following Jesus, you're following this, you're following that, and it really kind of became this, what does it mean to be faithful? What is it? And you have all these people going back and forth. Well, if you did this, you're not a faithful Christian, you're not a faithful church. Well, if you did this. And so this has been a topic of, hey, what does it mean to be a faithful church? What does it mean to resist the forces of Babylon? And here's the one universal conclusion that I've come to that's true of all of us. Okay, when it comes to how much we are shaped by culture, how much we are shaped by Babylon, this is what I have determined, I believe, is universally true of every single one of us. And here it is. We are all influenced by Babylon more than we think we are. Every single one of us. Now, we tend to look at other people and go, oh yeah, but they're really influenced. Okay, but Revelation isn't telling you to look at them. It's telling you to look at you. Every pastor I ever heard, oh, that church they're just corrupt. They never said anything about themselves. Our church is great, that church is... No. The whole point of Revelation is, as followers of Jesus, individuals and collectively as a community, is how do we identify Babylon's presence among us? Not them. And all of us, to some extent, we're influenced by Babylon more than we think we are. We are. See, Babylon, the power of Babylon is most obvious in like its big forms, but I think it's most present in little everyday things. These little everyday things that shape us, and we don't even realize they shape us. I remember when cell phones first came out. I was like in high school. My sister and I got an old school flip phone that my parents said, here, you guys can share this, which meant she was older. She had it the whole time. I never saw it once. That's what it really meant. But I remember that first phone, all you could do was dial. Like you flipped it open and you dialed, and it was really just, hey, call mom and dad, because I think it probably cost $27 a minute or whatever to use that phone. But then over the years, I've watched how cell phones have just evolved. You know, and you go from the flip phone, then all of a sudden you can start, texting, and then you can start looking at the internet on it, and then now it's incredible. And we take cell phones everywhere with us, and we have them all the time. And cell phones are they're this constant promise that you can be entertained, and you can be connected, and you can know whatever you want to know. But it's been proven over and over again in studies that cell phones actually detract from human interaction. That the presence of a cell phone, not even the use of a cell phone, the presence of a cell phone detracts from human interaction. A lot of people, they take their phone out and they put it on the table when you sit down for coffee. The presence of that phone sitting there drops the meaningfulness of that interaction significantly, because here's what studies have found. Here's what happens. The presence of a cell phone. Again, the presence of a cell phone. Here's two things that your mind automatically does subconsciously. One, it makes you less empathetic, the ability to connect with people. Automatically reduces that. Two, and I thought this was interesting. The only thing you will talk about in the presence of a cell phone is what you don't mind being interrupted with. Because you're just assuming, well, it's going to go off, they're going to get a text, they're going to want to check something. So on a subconscious level, you're like, I'm not going to talk about the deepest, most meaningful things. Like, I'm not going to open up to you about, the struggles in my life. Because if we do that, I don't want to be interrupted, and I'm just going to assume that we're going to be interrupted. So these things that are really neat, and in a lot of ways they're really helpful. Like, they can be really, really helpful. They also distract from human relationships. And here's what I found in my life. I don't notice how much I'm on my cell phone until my wife or children pointed out to me. Dad, you're on your phone too much. Honey, you're on your phone too much. See, what it really takes to identify the presence of Babylon in your life is someone else. Because often it happens in ways that are so subtle, you won't even realize it. You won't even know. You won't even know the extent to which you're being shaped. And so what it really takes is honesty and vulnerability and openness. It really takes living in committed community and relationships with other people who have that same commitment. And it takes a vulnerability that, I'm willing to be challenged. The problem is, here's the problem, and some of this goes back to COVID too. We prefer to surround ourselves with echo chambers. We prefer to go to churches, we prefer to go online, we prefer to listen to podcasts that already agree with us. So we've literally surrounded ourselves with people who tell us everything that we already know and everything that we already want to hear. And we get mad at anyone that disagrees with us. And we wonder why churches become more and more and more Babylonian, and why Christians become more and more and more Babylonian. It's because we've lost the ability to sit down with each other and to be open and to be honest and to be vulnerable and to pray together and to read scripture together and to discern in what ways are we being influenced and shaped by Babylon. Because a lot of times we do things that we think, hey, this is good. But it's actually not. I love, some people will be like, I can't believe you would listen to that person. I can't believe you would read that person. I've seen college professors get fired because they had students read a book by someone that the administration disagreed with. I love listening to people I disagree with. I shared this before, but I had a conversation not too long ago with a guy from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and a Catholic guy. And here's what was so fascinating. They were asking me, these two guys straight up asked me, why can't Protestants get along? That was their question. It was a mystery to them. But internally, we're part of the Protestant tradition, right? Internally, as Protestants, we're like, well, why don't we associate with them? Oh, well, because they think this, and they think this, and they think that. And so it's for us, it's this is doctrinal purity. This is faithfulness to God. We're being faithful to God. That's why we don't like these people. That's why we don't like those people. But you have these two people who are outside of that Protestant tradition looking at it and going, I don't understand. I mean, you all agree with each other on Jesus, and then you just blast each other. And it's that outside perspective that all of a sudden opens up our eyes and is like, wow, maybe I'm missing something here. Let me just say this, and this may be a bold statement, you may get mad at me, but that's okay. If God always agrees with you and you're always the good guy, then you have made God in your image instead of being conformed to his image. Okay? Because I'm just going to tell you, when I read scripture, I'm not always the good guy. God, believe it or not, God doesn't always agree with me. Sometimes I have ideas and I'm like, oh man, I really was wrong there. If you're always right, you're always the good person, God always agrees with you, then you have made God in your image, and good luck with that. The whole point of the New Testament is for us to be formed into the image of God. And part of that formation is being able to discern the impact and the presence of Babylon in our lives. This is why as a church, when we talk about what's central to our church, what is it that our church is formed around, we always talk about these 7 practices. And again, you don't have to read through all these. You can see these on our website if you want to. But the point of all of these practices is this is what we do when we get together in the various environments. Because what all these practices do is they create space for God. And when God is allowed to work and when God is allowed to move, when we've created space for God, then God begins to transform us. And as we are transformed within community, then we encourage and we challenge one another. If we really want to discern the impact of Babylon in our lives and in our world, and it's far greater in your life than you think it is, I promise you that. What we need is each other. What we need is to form a community centered around the presence of Jesus through his Spirit. And we have to have an openness and a willingness to listen. In the New Testament, in the Bible specifically, God over and over again comes to people through the voice of another person. We need to learn to hear God from the voice of one another. Not saying everything someone says to you is the voice of God. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying we learn to discern the voice of God and the presence of Babylon as we listen to what God is doing among us. Let me pray. Father, I thank you. I thank you for your love for us. I thank you that you gave your life for us. I thank you that you rose again and have conquered death and made a way. And God, I know Isaiah says that we live in a world filled with God's glory, but we also live in a world saturated in the allure of Babylon. A reality of power and wealth and greed and status. And God, most of us can't even begin to understand the ways that has shaped us and the ways that has mal-shaped us. And God, what we desire as a church is to be a community that's being formed into the image of Jesus. That's what transformation looks like in the New Testament, the image of Jesus. And the only hope we have of doing that is you and each other. That's what we need. If we want to resist the powerful force of Babylon to shape us, then we need your presence, your Spirit, and we need one another to listen, to love, to speak. God, help us to be a community that reflects you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.